A man drinking water suddenly realizes in horror the plastic water bottle in his hand is shrinking rapidly. Sensing something is wrong, a flight attendant yells for passengers to fasten their seatbelts. But before she can finish her sentence, the water in a glass mysteriously begins to float. Before anyone can react, the plane plunges violently toward the ground. This is the disaster thriller Flight 7500, inspired by the real 2005 incident involving Flight Helios 522. The passenger jet, flying at an altitude of 10,000 meters, suddenly encounters a bizarre air current and is instantly vacuum sealed. Hundreds of lives are lost, and no one survives. Today, let's take a few minutes to examine just how terrifying cabin depressurization can be. The story begins with what seems like an ordinary journey. Flight 7500 is preparing for boarding as usual at the airport. It's a long-haul flight from Los Angeles, USA to Tokyo, Japan. Guided by flight attendants, passengers chat and laugh as they board the plane. However, in the crowd, one man looked unusually tense. He kept a cautious eye on his surroundings and carefully slid a strange wooden box under the seat in front of him. His strange behavior catches the eye of an old man nearby. Noticing the old man's curious gaze, Lance shoots him a hostile glare. Meanwhile, in the service area of the cabin, flight attendant Laura is flirting playfully with Captain Pete. 3 minutes later, all passengers have boarded. After confirming the passenger list is complete, Pete radios the control tower to request takeoff clearance. The tower grants permission, and the plane moves to the runway. After some turbulence, it lifts smoothly into the sky. However, just as Pete began climbing the plane to a higher altitude, it suddenly started to shake. Fortunately, the shaking doesn't last long and the aircraft stabilizes. Just as passengers start to wonder what happened, Pete's voice comes over the intercom, explaining that the plane hit a patch of turbulence during the climb. Hearing this, the passengers relax. Everything seems fine again. But just as the plane ascends to cruising altitude, Laura notices something wrong with Lance in the rear cabin. His face is contorted in pain, as if he's suffering from a sudden illness. Laura approaches and tries to ask him what's wrong, but Lance is unable to speak. His condition draws the attention of nearby passengers. Sensing trouble, Laura grabs the intercom and asks if there's a doctor on board. Hearing the announcement, a passenger named Brad hurries to the back. One look at Lance and Brad suspects either a heart attack or an epileptic seizure. He tries asking Lance which one it is, but Lance still can't speak. Before Brad can administer help, Lance starts convulsing violently. Then suddenly goes limp in his seat. Seeing this, Brad panics and quickly instructs the crew to move Lance to the service area so he can begin emergency treatment. Despite Brad's best efforts, even using a defibrillator, Lance shows no signs of life. With Lance mysteriously dead, the passengers begin whispering among themselves. Some suspect epilepsy, while others fear it might be some kind of contagious disease. Soon the entire cabin is filled with speculation and unease. Upon hearing that a passenger has died suddenly, Pete immediately reports the incident. But the plane is already deep into its flight path, and turning back is no longer an option. With no other choice, the crew clears out a section of the cabin and places Lance's body there. But what the passengers don't know is the nightmare is just beginning. Back in his seat, Brad can't shake the feeling that something isn't right. He starts to suspect that Lance didn't die from an illness, but from suffocation. But the aircraft's oxygen system is functioning normally, so how could suffocation even be possible? While Brad puzzles over this, he suddenly notices something shocking. His thumb is turning black. Then he spots the water bottle next to him shrinking rapidly. That's when Brad realizes the plane is experiencing a dangerous drop in cabin pressure. At the same time, Laura, who's tidying up the aisle, notices it too. She immediately jumps to her feet and yells for everyone to get back to their seats and fasten their seatbelts. But before Laura can finish her sentence, the plane begins to shake violently once again. A passenger who hadn't fastened his seatbelt in time was instantly thrown into the air by the sudden turbulence and slammed into the overhead compartment. But the terrifying part was only just beginning. Panicked passengers suddenly felt like they couldn't breathe. While everyone was still confused, the cabin pressure dropped to 0, and the oxygen masks above each seat suddenly dropped down. Passengers grabbed the masks immediately, trying to breathe, but due to the lack of oxygen and the rapid decompression, several of them passed out on the spot. Thankfully, Brad reacted quickly and helped a few passengers put on their masks properly. clearly. But when Brad turned around, he was shocked to find his wife Pia slumped unconscious in her seat. Taking a deep breath, Brad tried to rush over to help her, but there was no oxygen left in his mask. It turned out the oxygen had been drained too quickly from the tanks during decompression. That's when Brad spotted the emergency oxygen supply in the aisle. He opened the valve and connected the backup line, then grabbed a canister and rushed back to his seat. With oxygen flowing again, Pia soon regained consciousness. At the same time, the shaking plane finally began to stabilize. As the pressure normalized, cabin oxygen levels also returned to normal. Just as everyone was still on edge, Pete's voice came through the intercom. He explained that the aircraft had just passed through a severe turbulence zone, and during the shaking, one of the cabin's pressure seals had been damaged. Pete had lowered the altitude, and cabin pressure had now been restored. Once safety was confirmed, the passengers finally dared to remove their masks. The flight attendants immediately began calming the anxious passengers. At that moment, one of the lavatory doors opened, and Laura discovered Raquel unconscious inside. She quickly grabbed an oxygen tank and began emergency resuscitation. Fortunately, Raquel had only passed out briefly from oxygen deprivation and quickly woke up. But just as the passengers were starting to breathe a sigh of relief, Jake quietly sneaked upstairs to the second level. He found Lance and shamelessly stole his watch and valuables. But that wasn't all. After stealing the items, Jake didn't leave. Instead, he actually took a selfie with Lance's lifeless body. And just as he snapped the photo, something eerie happened. Meanwhile, in the lower cabin, Brad noticed that the screen on the back of the seat suddenly displayed a strange image. A strange figure appeared on the wing of the plane. Brad leaned in for a closer look, but his wife nudged him. When he turned back, the screen had already returned to normal. In the cockpit, Pete was trying to contact the ground and request an emergency landing at the nearest airport. But due to bad weather, the radio signal kept cutting in and out. He couldn't get through. While Pete grew increasingly frustrated, Laura encountered something even more bizarre. Looking out the window, Laura spotted a fighter jet flying beside the plane. Thinking it was just passing by, she turned to Susie beside her, wanting to show her. But before Laura could say anything, another colleague came over with shocking news. One of the passengers was missing. Hearing this, Laura assumed the person had suffered an accident. It wasn't until they asked a female passenger that they learned the man had gone up to the second floor just after the plane stabilized. Laura rushed upstairs with Susie to search the second floor, but when they got there, they were met with a chilling sight. Not only was the missing passenger nowhere to be found, but Lance's dead body had also vanished. Laura immediately reported the situation to Pete. Pete told Laura to take someone and search more thoroughly. He guessed Lance might have slipped from his seat during the earlier turbulence. Laura and Pete's conversation happened to be overheard by Brad as he passed by. Hearing that Lance had disappeared, Brad recalled the moment during boarding when Lance had an unusual expression. Could he have faked his death and been planning something sinister all along? When Brad mentioned Lance again, a few nearby passengers also joined in, saying they too had noticed something strange about Lance earlier. Thinking back to the string of bizarre events, a terrifying thought crept into everyone's minds. Could the plane have been hijacked? Just then, passenger Jacinta walked into the aisle holding Lance's wooden box. Brad grabbed some tools and pried open the box, but what was inside left everyone on edge. Inside was a strange-looking doll that gave everyone the creeps. Jacinta recognized it immediately. It was the infamous death doll, and legend says that wherever it appears, death is sure to follow. Could the plane really have been hijacked? Meanwhile, Laura and Susie were still searching the plane for the missing Lance, but even after searching the entire aircraft, they found nothing. Just as Laura was about to give up, she noticed the luggage storage compartment. As she looked around inside, the plane suddenly shook again, and a suitcase rolled out of the cargo area and hit her. Turning around, Laura saw that the suitcase was actually Lance's. She reached to lift it but found it unnaturally heavy. Curious, Laura unzipped the suitcase, and to her horror, she found a human body inside. From the cargo area came Laura's terrified scream, and Susie, waiting above, tried to rush down to help. But before she could react, a thick white fog suddenly began pouring out from the cargo bay. Before Susie could figure out what was happening, a hand suddenly reached out. Fortunately, she reacted quickly and managed to avoid being pulled down. But the strange phenomena weren't over yet. The white mist began seeping out into the main cabin. Just as it was about to reach Susie, Brad and the others heard the noise and rushed over. Susie turned around, but the mist had vanished. Staring at the empty cabin, Susie was filled with confusion. Had she imagined it? Before she could figure it out, something even stranger happened. Everyone was stunned as they watched Susie suddenly vanish into thin air. At that moment, the plane started shaking again, and in a panic, they all ran back downstairs. As they passed the cockpit, they noticed the door was wide open. Liz stepped in to look, and was shocked to find that both Captain Pete and the co-pilot were dead. Seeing this, Brad became even even more convinced. They were definitely dealing with a hijacking. In a panic, Brad rushed to warn the others, but in the corridor, something tripped him. Brad turned around and was shocked to see that it was Raquel who had tripped him, but he clearly remembered she had been in her seat just moments ago. But this wasn't the most disturbing part. When Brad and the others returned to the cabin, he was shocked to see himself and his wife sitting in their seats, showing no signs of life. At that moment, the cabin's TV screen suddenly lit up with a breaking news alert. The airline had issued a heartbreaking announcement. Flight 7500 had suffered a sudden decompression, and all passengers and crew members had perished. The fighter jet Laura had seen earlier, it had been sent by the military to investigate the situation. Even worse, because the plane was on autopilot, no one could land it manually. In 3 hours, the aircraft would run out of fuel. Watching the news broadcast, Brad looked around the cabin and everything finally came back to him. When the plane hit turbulence earlier, cabin pressure dropped so rapidly that before Pete could lower altitude, every person on board, including the pilots, had suffocated to death. Everything they had experienced after that was just a hallucination before death. Remembering everything, Brad held his wife tightly, shocked by how sudden death had come. In the end, the plane crashed into a mountain range, and all 115 passengers and 6 crew members were killed. And that was the complete story of the terrifying thriller Flight 7500. Overall, the film was well executed, especially the ending, which delivered a shocking twist no one saw coming. Who would have thought cabin decompression could be this horrifying? Alright, that's all for today. See you next time.